My name is David Hoyer. I'm working at Mind Foundation as Integration Program Manager, and I'm here to moderate track 3 in this afternoon. And I have the pleasure to introduce Dr. Manvir Singh. He is going to present his talk on rigorously evaluating claims about the scope and history of traditional psychedelic use. Manvir Singh is a postdoctoral research fellow at the Institute for Advanced Study in Toulouse. He studies the foundations of complex cultural practices that reliably develop across human societies, including shamanism, music, story, and law. Since 2014, he has conducted anthropological fieldwork among the Mentawai, I hope that's pronounced correctly, in Indonesia, with a focus on shamanism and witchcraft. In 2020, he graduated with a PhD from Harvard's Department of Human Evolutionary Biology. He has published in numerous different fields, for example, on the cultural evolution of shamanism, and a more recent publication on magic, explanations, and evil, the origins and designs of witches and sorcerers. One more thing that I would like to announce right now is that after his talk, there will be the option to have an extended Q&A session in a speaker's corner, which Abigail will guide you to. And yeah, no, okay, good. Yeah, thank you very much.
Okay, hello. Thank you for that introduction, David. So the title of my talk is something like Rigorously Evaluating the Scope and History of Traditional Psychedelic Use. I have summarized it in this much more basic question of how widely were psychedelics used in history and in which contexts. I'll start very quickly with a little background about myself. Like David mentioned, I'm an anthropologist, and as an anthropologist, one of my main domains of study has been shamanism. This is one of my papers. Everyone should look it up and cite it. Since 2014, like David mentioned, I have been conducting fieldwork with the Mentawai people of Indonesia, studying their law, their religion, their aesthetics, and again, a major focus of mine has been shamanism. I'm here giving this talk today because of claims that I have seen repeated very widely in the popular discourse on psychedelics, shamanism, and deep history. This is just a sampling of some of these claims. This is from Vox. Cultures around the world have been taking psychedelics for thousands of years. Each one developed rituals for them. This is from a Neolife article in 2020. Psychedelics have been used for millennia. Indigenous peoples around the world, from the Amazon basin to Gabon to the American Great Plains. This is from Michael Pollan's 2019 book. Elements of shamanism have a role to play in psychedelic therapy, as indeed it has probably done for several thousand years, before there was a such thing as science. So all of these claims share what I will call the ancient worldwide psychedelic shamanism hypothesis, the OPS hypothesis, according to which, 1, psychedelics were widespread, so they appeared and were used around the world. 2, not only were they widespread, but in those places they go back deep, so they have been used for millennia. And 3, they have been used in shamanic contexts for therapeutic healing. This is, of course, a very convenient narrative. It legitimates modern applications. It says, don't be afraid of psychedelics. By using them, we are recapitulating these deep, ancient, wise, universal practices that, if anything, have been lost and forgotten. Seeing all of these claims and knowing a little about shamanism across cultures, I dug more deeply into the anthropological literature, a dive that ultimately concluded in an essay that I wrote for Vice entitled Psychedelics Weren't as Common in Ancient Cultures as We Think, which gives you my thesis a little early. The organizers read it, they thought it would make an interesting contribution to some of the discussions, and they invited me. So today, I will be covering the contents of this article. I will be surveying some of the research on the scope of historical psychedelic use. There are some differences between this talk and the article, so if you are interested, I invite you to check out the piece afterwards. So what are psychedelics? Now, for some people, this is a very broad term covering psychotropic substances more broadly, including things as divergent as tobacco and opiates. Others, perhaps most people over here, have a much more constrained usage in mind, restricting the term to 5-HT agonists, that is, to substances like DMT, LSD, psilocybin, and so on. We can examine the anthropological literature on both ends to really get a sense of the scope. So let's start by considering psychotropic substances. So how widely were psychotropic substances used? The best answer to this question comes from a database built by the anthropologist and shamanism expert Michael Winkelmann. So Winkelmann examined anthropological descriptions of magical religious practitioners, so of priests, of shamans, of healers, etc., in 45 diverse societies, from the Babylonians to Kalahari hunter-gatherers. It is admittedly a small sample, but the societies in this sample were selected to be representative of human cultural and geographic diversity, meaning that it is somewhat reasonable to make inferences about humanity more broadly on the basis of this sample. And this is just what I said. So what did he find? Well, practitioners used psychotropic drugs, including not only hallucinogens, but opiates, stimulants, and narcotics in 22 of the 45 societies that he looked at, so a little less than half. Note that this excludes alcohol and some other substances. Unfortunately, he did not code which particular psychotropic drugs in particular were used. Something that I want to note very quickly is that in 4 of the societies he examined, drugs were only used to train practitioners. Here is a description from Nisa, a Kung woman from the Kalahari, about consuming a root that helped her learn how to trance. I'm just going to read it. She explained, "There is a root that helps you learn to trance, which they dug for me. My mother put it in a little pouch and said, 'Now you will start learning this because you are a young woman already.' I started to tremble. People rubbed my body as I sat there, feeling the effect getting stronger and stronger. My body shook harder and I started to cry. I cried while people touched me and helped me with what was happening to me." I've included this quote not only because it is evocative, but also to highlight how in these contexts, drugs are not, in these particular contexts, in these 4 contexts, drugs are not used in the healer-patient interaction, but rather to help trainees cultivate status as healers. Okay, so that was a very brief dive into psychotropic substances. Most of this talk will be spent on 5-HT agonists. Like I mentioned, these are the serotonergic or classic psychedelics. They include psilocybin, DMT, LSD, mescaline, and so on. There are many claims of peoples around the world using these psychedelics in hallucinogenic doses, but in fact there has been very little systematic work investigating their global and historical usage. An important exception to this, however, is the work of Martin Fortier, who people may be familiar with. Martin studied psychedelics, cognitive science, and anthropology. He actually worked with the Shipibo people of Peru, famous for their ayahuasca and pictured in the back here. Martin started what he called the HUTHAC database, the hallucinogenic use throughout time and space database. It was a very ambitious project. It was meant to include more than 1,000 cultures. He scoured academic books, historical chronicles, the diaries of explorers, and for every mention of hallucinogenic use, he noted not only which substances it was, but who used them, were they in hallucinogenic doses, how were they used, and really critically, how reliable is that evidence? So he classified evidence according to, is it observational, is it botanical, is it secondhand, etc. Now, very tragically, Martin died a little over a year ago. But before he died, he posted some of his preliminary findings online. You can find a link to those writings at the end of this talk, and I can also send them to you. They're also linked to in the Vice piece. So Martin found that reliable evidence, at least in his survey, the survey that he had done before his passing, reliable evidence was limited to Meso and South America. So the Rio Grande, that is the area at the border of Mexico and the United States, and southwards. Some usage clearly goes back thousands of years, and we'll see an example of this in the coming slides. Still, though, even in the Americas, it was a very small number of cultures for which there is reliable evidence that indicates classic psychedelic use in hallucinogenic doses. So Martin estimated that on the basis of reliable evidence, if we are most liberal, about 5% of cultures in the Americas use psychedelics. On a global scale, if we compare that to linguistic diversity and what percentage of linguistic diversity is in the Americas, we can get a very rough back-of-the-envelope calculation that says less than 1% of cultures engaged in hallucinogenic usage of classic psychedelics, according to Martin's preliminary survey. Now, very importantly, absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. It is reasonable to suspect that psychedelic use may have gone undocumented. Still, I want to make two very important points. The first is that, and this is a point that Martin had made, when psychedelics were used, it was very clear to anthropologists and explorers. It was salient, there was a lot of evidence. It does not seem likely, at least as anthropologists arrived in societies, that they were missing a lot of indigenous psychedelic use. Second, we should of course be open to all hypotheses, but I think we should be skeptical of ideologically convenient stories which might lead us to make very strong inferences on the basis otherwise of data that requires a lot of interpretation. So aside from Fortier, another person who has tried to do this systematically has been Andy Letcher. So in his book Shroom, he investigated every purported case of indigenous psychedelic mushroom consumption, including reports like this one of mushroom madness in the New Guinea highlands. He confirmed two, so that was psilocybin mushrooms in pre-Columbian Mexico and the consumption of fly agaric mushrooms in North Asia. And these contain mucimol, the fly agaric, so they do not even qualify as serotonergic psychedelics. Later, he actually has a blog post about this. He confirmed that the Sami of Scandinavia actually do consume the boiled hallucinogenic urine of reindeer. There's an interesting blog post where this is, in the book, he says he couldn't find evidence, and then he actually goes and finds it. So in other words, very few reliably documented cases over here. Now, Fortier and Letcher prioritized observational and botanical evidence of psychedelic consumption. Yet many people point to myths, they point to art, as evidence that psychedelics have been used widely and throughout history. I think myths and art are very useful, but I think we should recognize that they are very open to interpretation, and in the absence of other data or systematic comparisons, anecdotal interpretations should be seen with skepticism. And I will just provide an example of this. We'll just dig into a case study. So to highlight how easy it is to make questionable inferences on the basis of literary evidence, let's focus on a very popular idea, the idea that sacred, powerful mushrooms have suffused the world's mythologies. This idea appeared in the original Life article, which made magic mushrooms so popular. Wesson wrote, "The supernatural power of mushrooms is still believed among widely scattered peoples." A list, et cetera, on the basis of that, was it not probable that long ago, long before the beginnings of written history, our ancestors had worshipped a divine mushroom? A more recent example is in the work of Michael Winkelmann, who in a 2019 review wrote that mythologies from all the major religions of the world indicate the role of psilocybin mushrooms in the ancient evolution of human religions. So to get a sense of how accurate these claims are, of how true these are, I conducted a very simple preliminary analysis while preparing this talk. So I looked at something called the Human Relations Area Files, which is a database of anthropological observations and reports based at Yale. Among its many documents, this database contains more than 50,000 paragraphs on the mythology of 321 cultures. And those paragraphs come from more than 2,000 documents. I then searched all of these paragraphs for the word mushroom, and I found 10 paragraphs out of 50,000, which contained the word mushroom, and those came from 10 cultures. Now, when we compare the frequency of other psychoactive substances in mythology, we find the following: 92 paragraphs about wine, 150 about kava, 162 about beer, 305 about peyote, 463 about tobacco. And you'll see, for instance, 305 contain peyote, but those are only in 10 cultures. Similarly, 150 are about kava, but those are only in 9 cultures. So in other words, compared to other substances, mushrooms appear both in fewer cultures and in fewer paragraphs per culture. So pardon me, 1 paragraph per culture for mushrooms compared to, for instance, 30 paragraphs per culture for peyote. So despite a worldwide range, mushrooms appear to feature little in the world's mythologies. Now, I don't want people to take this as a definitive analysis. This was very preliminary. I use it more to just demonstrate. I think it is much more a call for us to be careful and to take a more systematic approach when addressing the question of ancient worldwide psychedelic use. Now, before we finish with classic psychedelics, I want to consider perhaps the 2 most famous examples of indigenous psychedelic use: ayahuasca in the Amazon and peyote in Mexico and North America. So as this quote from Neolife reminds us, it is common to think of these as ancient. For thousands of years, Amazonians have used ayahuasca. For thousands of years, Great Plains Indians have used peyote. Now, in fact, when we actually dig into ethnohistory, the story is much more complicated. If we look at ayahuasca, over the last 25 years, researchers like Peter Gao and Bernd Brabeck de Mori have accumulated evidence showing that ayahuasca likely diffused through the Amazon in the last 300 years, and especially over the last century. Now, there are many lines of evidence that suggest a recent diffusion. I'm just going to quickly go through a couple. So the Shipibo, the people most often associated with indigenous ayahuasca use, actually say that it is not indigenous, but rather came from the Cucama, a people missionized and settled early in Spanish rule. And I want to point out something very interesting. Brabeck de Mori came as a master's student to study ayahuasca. Things happened. He married a Shipibo woman. He stopped being a researcher. He lived there for a while. He became a teacher. And he writes about there being these double narratives that are presented to outsiders and narratives that are indigenously shared about what ayahuasca is, where ayahuasca is coming from. It's really interesting stuff that I also think, like, as a community that is often talking about indigenous ayahuasca use, should be conceptualized and engaged with. When he surveyed old reports, Brabeck de Mori could actually track the historical diffusion of ayahuasca with the movements of missionaries and the rubber industry. Perhaps most compelling, I think, is linguistic evidence. So the Amazon has dazzling linguistic diversity, yet the words for ayahuasca and related activities are strikingly similar. Similarly, and so he is an ethnomusicologist. What his major contribution was documenting the music of many groups and comparing them. People sing hugely widely varied songs, except for ayahuasca songs, which are not only very similar across these very distantly related groups, but are often actually sung in non-Amazonian languages, most often Quechua or Spanish. So what about peyote? Peyote does really seem to be ancient. For instance, there are dried peyote buttons that have been found next to rock art dating nearly 6,000 years old. Yet the evidence of ancient use is restricted to the Rio Grande area and southwards, that is to peyote's native range. There is meanwhile no evidence that peyote has been used in the Great Plains until the 18th or even 19th century. That is when peyote began to be transported with trains and with the settlement on reservations. So in short, just to summarize these last 2 examples, many popular narratives about ancient use, I think, are either much more complicated, if not wrong. And what these narratives are endorsing and what they're actually capitalizing on is this image of indigenous peoples as ahistorical, as inheritors of an unchanging, millennia-old tradition, rather than as flexible innovators and adopters themselves. So the final question that I just want to consider is, how were psychedelics used? According to a popular view, modern therapeutic applications are echoes of ancient practices. This idea pops up often, an example being in this quote by the UCLA psychiatrist Charles Grob on the Goop website. So Charles Grob says, "The shaman would administer these compounds only for clear, circumscribed reasons, such as an initiation rite or a healing ceremony to address individuals with severe medical or psychological problems. This idea is very simple, it's very familiar. The patient is psychologically distressed, and the shaman administers this drug." Now, in actuality, there is no systematic work on the context in which psychedelics are consumed. That is, work that systematically examines across cultures, codes from ethnographic documents, how people actually use psychedelics. Nevertheless, anthropologists who have compared, at least qualitatively or anecdotally, the use of hallucinogens seem to agree that they are typically used as a means for the practitioner of tapping into the supernatural, of entering a state distinct from normal human experience in which they can acquire powers and do things that are otherwise not possible. And that includes healing, it includes divining, it might be including becoming an animal. It's very frequently killing enemies. An evocative example of this is this documentary by Tim Ash and Napoleon Chagnon called Magical Death. People here might be familiar with this video. The entire video is available online, but I thought we would just watch a small clip together to get a sense of what this looks like. Oh. Weird. Cool. Can people see? Oh, the ball. I can narrate it. It's like, Dedehewa assembles the shamans in the back of the hut where they snort like a DMT snuff. So Dedehewa is the leader of the shamans among this group, and here's a group of these shamans, they're snorting the DMT snuff. And then it's something like, he becomes the Hekura spirits. Hekura are a class of spirits among the Yanomama. They start to channel them. They're continuing to snort them over here. When you watch the video, you hear a lot of like coughing and like, you know, those kinds of noises. So they're becoming Hekura right now. So as Hekura, they are chanting, and they're calling upon the spirit of the Hekura to kill babies in a neighboring village. And so then, I'm not sure if that's at this point, but one of them becomes the babies, or a baby in a neighboring village. It might not be at this point. Okay, so at this point, I think they are attacking the babies in the neighboring village. You get the idea. I wanted to end the video at a point when they act out as the dying babies. So over here, they might be feeding on the babies, on the souls of the babies. Now, as you saw, the Yanomama shamans, in this case, so in the complete video, they show a number of uses. They show for healing illness, and then a big part of it is about what they call magical death. So another group wants to build an affiliation with this group, and so Dedehewa is this highly prestigious shaman, and he says, okay, we'll build this alliance, and for you, we will kill the babies in this rival group. And I wanted to highlight this because I think it's very easy to tell stories that are largely divorced from the ethnographic reality in these contexts, to kind of make believe what we want psychedelics to be, because that serves a really convenient story, when the reality is much more complicated and really involves all of the complexities of human psychology, human motivation, and human desire. So just to conclude, psychoactive substances were widely used, but far from universal. Reliable evidence of hallucinogenic use of classic psychedelics is restricted to few, 5% or less, cultures in the Americas. Literary and iconographic evidence can be dubious without corroboration. Many claims of ancientness lack evidence or are much more complicated. And the modern therapeutic encounter is a misleading analogy for indigenous applications. So these are, I think, very reasonable suggestions more systematic work on the scope of historical psychedelic use and more circumspect claims about where, when, and how psychedelics were used. And if I want to have a simple sentence that really describes the scope and nature of historical psychedelic use, it would be this. As far as we know, a tiny proportion of the world's societies used serotonergic psychedelics more than a couple hundred years ago, often in ways vastly different from therapeutic applications in industrialized Western societies. Here are the references, here are the links. This talk is in honor of Martin. He is the one who was ambitious enough to engage in these projects and to ask these questions. You can find the Vice piece very easily. You just Google Vice, psychedelics, and my name, and that is it. You can also follow this link at the bottom, and you can find Martin's writings.
Yes, thank you very much for this very interesting presentation, which is, I think, very important for the field, right? Making sure the narratives that are often subscribed to are actually correct or not. So, I don't know, do we have questions from the online audience? Other than that, I would invite the live audience. Yes, Lucia, can you? Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Singh. I appreciate it. I have a question specifically relating to Soma and the origins of the Rig Veda.
Yeah, okay. I would hand the mic to Sandeep Nayak over here, who has done a much better investigation of Soma than I. And
so Soma, or also called Haoma in the Avesta, is clearly a real plant that existed. So basically, this is a legendary plant of the Indo-Aryans that in the Vedic tradition is called Soma, in the Avestan or Zoroastrian tradition called Haoma, clearly referring to a real plant. Two different religious texts that are very ancient that are describing the same thing in very similar ways. People use the descriptions of this to mean they must have been using a psychedelic. In both religious traditions, it's described as a pressable plant. They've even found in, I think, Turkmenistan, what appear to be Soma presses. A lot of the theories about what Soma is kind of break down when you try to constrain it by, like, it has to be a pressable plant that was found in Central Asia. So it's not a mushroom. It's probably, in my opinion, ephedra. There is still, up to the 1800s, in somewhere in Iran, a group of Zoroastrians that were continuing Soma ceremonies, calling it home, which is very similar to the Haoma, and they used ephedra. Up till recent times in Parsis in India, who are also Zoroastrian, they continued this Soma or Haoma tradition and used imported ephedra. So I think there's a lot of fevered speculation about what this might be and hope that it's psychedelics. And people try to pin Soma as being the root of whatever mystical experiences were being described in the Rig Veda, but I truly believe that humans don't require that to have that kind of mystical experience. And if you look at what it is, it's a stimulating, pressable plant that fits with the geographical range of ephedra. There's no real proof either way, though, one way or another.
thank you, Sandeep. Whoa, look at that knowledge dropped.
Great talk, thank you. So to what extent are you aware that the analogy of what we actually do in clinical practice, namely there's a patient with a problem who takes a psychedelic to address that problem, to what extent is that present in the ethnographic record? Certainly ritual use of ayahuasca and peyote seem to do that. Is that also a modern innovation, or what's your take on that?
Yeah, so there's this great book by Marlene Dobkin de Rios on the nature of ayahuasca use in Peru, where she really contrasts what is the way in which ayahuasca is used in the kind of local indigenous community and how is it used in retreats with Westerners. And in retreats with Westerners, it's very much within a model that I think is familiar to a lot of people. I have some kind of psychological distress or some problem that I want to overcome. The shaman administers the substance to me. In contrast, in the indigenous community, it's much more infrequent for the patient to consume the substance. It's always the practitioner. I think she has the precise numbers. It's maybe like 10% of the interactions have the patient consuming it. And the model is one that is very different. It's, for instance, I am being attacked by witchcraft. Can you please kind of engage with whatever forces are involved and fight them off? And I think more generally, when we look at like shamanic traditions are overwhelmingly about the practitioner or the specialist engaging with an unseen reality and drawing from it powers or relationships that can be used to provide services. And so many drugs that are used in these contexts are really about the practitioner, about the specialist consuming them, and about them engaging with the unseen reality and from it providing the service. But again, Dobkin de Rios' book is quite systematic. She has these interviews, but this is another case where there hasn't been a useful cross-cultural systematic project that has really gone through the reports and the records and coded what we see.
I don't want to end the interesting question and answer session here, but the next talk is waiting. So if you want to continue the discussion with Dr. Manvir Singh, I ask you to follow Lucia and him to the speaker's corner so that you can have an extended Q&A. Thank you very much again. Very interesting talk.